Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Product Tank. Glad to have you all here tonight. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to just talk through a couple of things. First of all, we are Product Tank, part of Mind the Product, founded London 2010. The chapters all over the world, over 185 cities. So if you haven't been part of Product Tank before, which I see a lot of familiar faces that have, great. If you haven't, we're all about sharing the product, probably call it product love, right? It's in the spirit of being with Ependo, and how we learn from each other, how we learn about the practice, we sharpen our skills and become better at our product practice and our craft. And so I'm Scott Yelton, one of the co-organizers. We also got Tatiana and Dan Moore here tonight, sponsors. I don't see Wes yet, but he's one of our co-organizers as well. Again, our goal is to learn, share, and inspire. I want to thank a couple sponsors here. Again, Dan is with Vaporware. Is here with us tonight. All right. And also, I want to thank User Voice for the tasty beverages and the food we've got tonight. Good stuff. Yeah. So, about our next upcoming events. First of all, December, we're not going to do a meetup. This will be our last meetup of the year. Enjoy the holidays. No, we got one right on the corner. Can't believe it's already here. But then in January, we're going to kick off with a content session, and I believe we've got something lined up already that's going to be really interesting and fantastic. So stay tuned for details. We'll be putting them out shortly. But go ahead and mark your calendars for January 16th. In fact, it's already posted on Meetup. You can go sign up today. And finally, we've got a page out there where we do post videos, we post content, and we've got a Slack channel for Mind the Product that's very active. That's the kind of the worldwide Slack channel. So there's a lot of content, a lot of activity. Yeah, please take a picture of that, because if you're not on that channel, you should be. So I would like to start off by introducing tonight's speaker by saying Ryan Singer, who's not only designed products that have features for millions. He's now head of strategy at Basecamp, and he's moved more from the design, the UX side, to more of the strategic side, I'll say. And in his latest book, Shape Up, it's all about how product teams can better shape, bet, and build products. So I found it very interesting read. For those of you who have not read it yet, I highly encourage it. And with that, without further ado, Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you. And again, we want to make this interactive tonight. So I'm going to be standing by with the mic for anybody that wants to speak after Ryan starts. Ryan, take it away.
All right, nice to see everybody. I can actually see you, which is kind of amazing. I've done these before where it's somebody sets a laptop in front of the room, and that doesn't work quite as well, and it looks like you have a pretty sophisticated setup out there. So can you all hear me all right? Is it working? Very good. Okay. So let me just start off with one question for you all, just so I have some context. Can I just get a hand from anybody who's already read the book or spent some time with the concepts in Shape Up? So we've got just one. Okay, good. Okay. So that gives me some things to talk about then, because I can give you some basics and talk through sort of why I wrote the book and what's in it. So I've been at Basecamp now for about 16 years, and we have gone through kind of a whole growing process in our own, history from just three of us who built the original V1 together back in 2003, 2004, going from 3 people, to 12 people to 50 people. Things change a little bit along the way there. And one thing that we started to notice was that the things that we were doing kind of instinctively when we were just a few of us became harder to explain and to pass on as we started to bring more and more people on. We had, new people into the company. So sort of just hoping that people would learn by osmosis wasn't working so well anymore. And then at the same time, we were getting more and more sort of questions from our peers, our friends, other people in the industry, asking us how we actually managed to ship new work so regularly, and how we did it in a way that seemed to be fairly calm, and how we kind of had this sort of orderly way of just every 6 weeks new features would get shipped, and we had a really healthy rhythm there. When I look out at what a lot of people seem to be doing in the industry today, um, it's influenced by. I mean, we grew up in the early days of Agile, when Agile was a bit more of a handful of principles and kind of a reaction. It was like the pendulum was swinging. Before, it was on one side where it was like, we're going to do a ton of upfront planning. We are going to nail down every little thing that this thing is supposed to do inside of a spec and sign on the dotted line that it's going to be exactly that. We kind of swung this other way toward, nobody knows what's going to happen and nobody knows how it's going to play out. And we're going to pivot constantly in this sort of a thing. And there's been some good things to that. But what we're seeing now is most teams around us seem to be running on this kind of ticket treadmill. You know, there's 2 weeks of work at a time. This is like, the sprints or the sort of scrum style. And what's happening is every 2 weeks, everyone stops everything that they're doing, and they have this terrible, sometimes 4-hour sprint planning meeting where there's a lot of debate and discussion about what to do. And then the outcome of the sprint planning meeting is a whole bunch of tickets, a whole bunch of tasks. I mean, sometimes people call them stories, but at the end of the day, they're little bits of little tiny commitments of like, this is the thing that somebody's going to do, right? And they go into some kind of a queue. So it's basically like a ticket system. And then what happens is this ticket system, we have, this is the things to do for the next 2 weeks. But of course, nobody has a crystal ball and nobody can see the future in advance. So all of these things that we said we were going to do for the next 2 weeks, it turns out that even you start on the very first one and there's a whole bunch of unknowns or interdependencies or things that you couldn't see from in advance that end up totally making you change course. And then the way that you spend your time and the way things actually turn out in the 2 weeks are, of course, different than what we planned, right? So we get to the end of the 2 weeks, the things that were supposed to be done don't get done. And then there's this kind of feeling, too, that there's just more and more work. Like there's this giant backlog and there's all of these tasks, and they're just going to keep getting slotted 2 weeks at a time. And it's some kind of some kind of a ticketing treadmill hell. It's kind of what we're seeing a lot of the places. And this is something that we've been able to avoid. And there's a handful of things that we've done that I've formalized in the book that explain the way that we work so that we can avoid this kind of a thing. The main thing, if I were to try and summarize sort of the goal that we're aiming for and what we have been able to actually achieve over the years, is we want everyone to have enough time to actually do some work that's meaningful. So 2 weeks is very rarely enough time to actually finish a project and to move something ahead and feel like you're going to celebrate it together at the end and say like, yes, that thing is done and that was meaningful and we got somewhere and now we can, toast and then do the next thing. So rather than working in a sort of 2 week time window, we actually work with longer cycles. We work 6 weeks at a time. And the logic there is that 6 weeks actually gives you enough time to do something meaningful and to actually finish it. Then when it comes to how we actually schedule and plan the work, we don't line up a whole bunch of tasks. We don't maintain a big backlog. Instead, what we have is we have some pre-work that we do before a cycle starts. So before we ever commit a project to a team to work on for 6 weeks, we do this work that we call shaping. And shaping means that we actually figure out what is the rough solution? What is the problem that we're solving? What are the basic elements, the sort of tentpole elements of the solution? Does this concept of what we want to do actually hang together in a way that we believe that this is viable inside of that time period, inside of that 6 weeks? And this is something that I can talk some more about what happens inside of the shaping process, but a huge mindset shift happens here where instead of taking something that we think we're supposed to do and then estimating it, we actually flip this around. And instead we say, what is our appetite for working on this thing? So instead of starting with a design concept and then putting a number on it, this is how long we estimate it's going to take, instead we say, this is the amount of time that we think that this problem deserves. This is our appetite, the amount of time we're willing to spend on this particular idea that came up, or this request that came up, or whatever it is. And now that we have this sort of budget of the amount of time we're interested in spending, what can we come up with as a design that fits inside of that requirement? So we're giving ourselves a constraint, and we're trying to fill in that and design within that constraint. And we're being really strict with ourselves. We're saying we are going to shape up a concept that matches our appetite. So it's something that's doable by a team within that period of time. And we're going to also actually dig into some of the main technical issues with it before we give it to a team. So we're not going to just throw it down to the team and say, go do discovery. We're going to actually take responsibility for eliminating risks and understanding the major technical issues before we bet on it, before we make a bet on it. And that's something else we'll talk about. So we've done this sort of shaping work and stress testing and de-risking to get to a point where there's a concept that fits into the amount of time that we want to budget, that we believe is sound. And then when we give that to the team, we give them some interesting constraints. So on the one side, we are giving the teams total freedom to actually figure out what the details of the solution are. So when we shape the work, we're doing it at a very kind of rough level of abstraction. So we're not giving them concrete wireframes. We're not giving them high fidelity mockups. We're not giving them a bullet list of it must do these 500 things. Instead, we're giving a very sort of, I'll show you some examples. We're looking at some very like rough sketched with a fat marker, or with this technique that we call a breadboard. So just very rough sketches, but that show what the concept is. And then rather than assigning tasks, we're actually giving the team this open period of time, this uninterrupted period of time, where they can collaborate together to figure out what the fine details are and to actually discover what the tasks are. And this works because of two different things that we do. So first of all, like I said, we're giving the team uninterrupted time. But second of all, we're also giving them a hard wall. If the project isn't finished at the end of the 6 weeks that we budget, there's this time wall. And from the very beginning, the team can feel that deadline pushing back on them. And they understand that they need to actually collaborate and engage with the scope and think about how it all fits together, and what are the really sort of unknown, tricky things that they have to solve versus what are the more routine pieces of work that they've done before. And they know that they need to sequence the work and tackle the problems and get pieces of the work done early so that they can actually get the most sort of the hard things solved first. You know, if you have to design an email template as part of a project, we've all designed 100 email templates before, and we know that there's unknowns in how we do the visual design, what the copy looks like, you know, how it all comes together. But there's no big mysteries there. You know, but if we started with the email template at the start of the project, we might spend, you know, we could easily spend a week kind of making the most beautiful email template and having a bunch of meetings and just debates about the right copy and so on. Versus if we know that the email template is something routine that we've done a million times before, but there's another piece of the problem that is maybe a bit more technical, a bit more deep, a bit more novel or unknown, that's the thing that we would want to dive into first. And then if we get to the 11th hour, we can always, you know, whip up in the email template. So this is the type of engagement with the problem that we expect the teams to do. And we especially expect them to actually do what we call scope hammering. So they have a fixed time to work, but the scope is actually variable. Now, we've done the shaping work of what the basic concept is, so they know what to do or what not to do. But within that, there's a lot of things where they could build out lots and lots of little edge cases or little enhancements, or, you know, gild every lily that comes by. And they need to actually take the responsibility to decide what's a must have and what is a nice to have. And what are the things that would be good to do, but actually aren't completely necessary. And what comes out of this is the teams get really engaged and they can feel that we're relying on them for their expertise and their creativity. And this is a world apart from the sort of ticket taker universe where you just have some story that you're supposed to fulfill. You grab that story, you read what the ticket says, and it says, this must happen here. And then you just code that, and then you kind of say, my work is done, and take the next ticket. So in the book, we call that the sort of traditional approach is a little bit like putting a project through a paper shredder. You split it up into tasks in advance, and then you hope that somehow all these little bits are going to glue together to be exactly what you hoped for in the beginning. But it doesn't work like that, So instead, we want the teams to actually be engaging. And so we have this principle that we call the circuit breaker. The circuit breaker means that if the project takes longer than we think, then by default, it's actually canceled. So we don't keep extending projects forever and ever and ever. We don't just keep giving things more time. We want to put a wall up so there's this kind of horizon of people can see how many weeks are left. And then inside of that, we want the teams to engage and make trade-offs together so that they actually get the work done. And then, so we've talked a little bit about shaping. And, after I've covered some of these basic points, maybe I could show you an example or two. We've talked a little bit about this upfront work of shaping before we actually commit the work to the team. And we've talked about how once the team takes on the shaped work, they have a long enough period of time, but not too long, just long enough that they can see the end, short enough that they can see the end from the beginning so they can feel that circuit breaker and that time wall, but long enough that they can actually get something meaningful done beginning to end. So we've got this sort of 6-week time box, and we're giving the team that full responsibility, not for tasks, but actually for the whole of the project, okay, inside of that time box. And then the third piece to this is how we actually make commitments. And so we don't talk about planning, and we don't talk about scheduling or estimating or things like that. We talk about betting. And so we have a betting table. And the notion is basically the shaping work that we do to figure out some kind of a concept and to do basically that discovery work that actually should not happen inside of a cycle because it's too risky. If we're doing that discovery work and then we're coming up with some kind of a rounded concept that hangs together, that has the key elements of the solution, and we've taken all of the rabbit holes out, and we are confident that this is a viable thing, this is a potential bet. This becomes something that we could schedule time for, but maybe we will, maybe we won't. There needs to be a discussion that happens there. And so at the betting table, what happens is we take a handful of things, maybe 1, 2, 3, maybe 3, 4 different shaped projects that are potential bets. And then we've got the people who actually have control over the resources. So whoever it is that actually decides what do programmers spend their time on? What do the designers spend their time on? Like, what are people doing? Somebody decides that. And actually in a lot of companies, people aren't even sure, who actually decides what we do, because it's like maybe a lot of people get into a meeting and there's a confusing committee discussion and there's a lot of opacity there. So what we have is a very clear structure. In the case of Basecamp, it's Jason, the CEO, David, the CTO. Jason's the final word on what happens. And then I'm also there as someone who's doing a lot of the shaping and bringing ideas to the table. And we have a senior programmer named Jeff who's often there as well. And this is the betting table. And what happens there is we look at the different shaped projects that are potentially worth doing in the next 6-week cycle. And we say to ourselves, what do we want to bet on for the next 6 weeks? And one thing, by the way, I should mention is that between the 6-week cycles, we have a period called cool down, which is 2 weeks long. This 2-week cool down between the cycles, first of all, it allows everybody to breathe, because you push toward the end of that 6 weeks to get that thing deployed and finished. And then it's nice to have a little bit of breathing space. So this is a time where The programmers can fix random bugs that they might have on their own list of things that they wish they could fix. Designers can look at different types of UI issues, or people can sort of coordinate across departments, like what's support been saying, or what's this thing that I've been hoping to talk to the programmer to do, but they've always been too busy, that sort of a thing. So there's a lot of things that happen in that cool down, but it's all free form. It's unscheduled. Nobody dictates how people spend their time. It's just that 2 weeks is there of cool down. And it's inside of this 2 weeks of cool down that we hold the betting table. Okay. And here's the thing with betting. When we talk about planning, we use the language of certainty as if we know what's going to happen. But the reality is that we don't actually know what's going to happen. So when we use the language of betting, we're using the language of risk. We're talking about uncertainty and risk. And bets have a few properties, So first of all, of course, bets have risk. So we understand that. Second of all, bets have some kind of a payoff, where there's something good that will come out of it. So we're not just throwing another 2 weeks, another 2 weeks, another 2 weeks, another 2 weeks, hoping that somewhere at the end of the treadmill, there's some sort of progress. No, we actually say, if we make this bet, after 6 weeks, what do we get? What will be finished? What are we going to celebrate? What's going to be done, right? So that's the first big thing, that bets have a payoff. The second big thing about betting is that a bet is a commitment. If you make a bet and then the time comes and the cards land on the table, or the dice roll or whatever it is, and then you say, oh, just kidding. Actually, I didn't want to bet that, and this isn't good for one's reputation, and in certain circles, it might not be good for one's health, right? So, what does it mean to commit and honor a bet in this situation? It means that if we say that the team is going to get 6 weeks, or whatever it is, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, for us, it's always 6 weeks. We actually give them the project for that 6 weeks, and then we honor it by leaving them alone. So nobody in the company gets to come to that team and go tap their shoulder and say, hey, I just need you to do this one thing for this one day, or just an hour. I just need you to do this one thing. No. If you interrupt somebody for 1 hour, that can kill their afternoon. If they lose the afternoon, that can kill the momentum for the day. And if they lose the day, that can mean what would have gotten done in that whole week doesn't happen, right? There are second order ripple effects that we take very, very seriously. Interruption is a bad thing, especially when we are trying to put the team into this collaborative environment where they're very engaged and they're working together inside of this time box to try and coordinate and get this piece of work done. So that's the second thing. We commit to the bet by leaving the team alone and not interrupting them. They have nothing to do except for this one thing that we decided was important for the next cycle, that was worth betting on. Okay. And then there's the third aspect, which is that when you make a bet, unless it's some sort of crazy, any kind of a sane bet, you have a cap on your downside. So what that means is if we bet 6 weeks on a project, and then the project starts to take 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 18 weeks, that we're spending more time than what we bet on, right? If I bet $10 on a certain outcome, either I win or I lose. But if I lose, I don't lose more than $10, right? And so if we bet 6 weeks on a project, because according to our appetite, what this work is worth relative to everything else we might potentially be doing, if this work is actually worth 6 weeks, and we end up spending a multiple of that, 12 weeks or whatever on it, this makes no sense at all. So we want to cap our downside, and we do that with that circuit breaker. If something turns out to take longer, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden it's worth more. It means that something has gone haywire and we're spending time on something that wasn't worth it, right? And now if we do actually want to spend more time on it, then of course we have that freedom. But the thing is that it should be deliberate. We should actually make a new bet. So when we get to this betting table, we're only looking 6 weeks ahead. And we only bet 1 6-week period of time at a time. And that's because, like I said, none of us can see the future. And we might have something that comes up during the course of that 6 weeks, which is the most brilliant idea anybody in the company has ever had. We could have something come up in the 6 weeks, which is a crisis that none of us anticipated. There could be a new customer coming on board that has a certain feature request or something that we absolutely need to do to make the sale. Anything can come up. When those things come up, we don't immediately respond to them, but we do know that at most we're 6 weeks away. And of course, closer and closer as the cycle ticks by. And then in the next cycle, that thing could cut in line and could be the most important thing that we do next. Okay, so there's a lot we could talk about betting, but that's the basic notion. So we've got the notion of shaping, which is actually doing the pre-work to do that discovery and figure out what the solution is before we give it to a team. So that way we have certainty that this is actually viable and the team knows what to do, and they're not just wandering around trying to figure out what success looks like and what's the right way and what's not the right way. Okay, so we're doing that upfront shaping work. Then the shaping work forms a potential bet. We call this a pitch, by the way. That's the way that we present the shaped work. Then at the betting table, we have a few options of some well-shaped projects, and we decide what is most worthwhile, what's most valuable, what's most important and timely to do right now. Then we give that to a team. The teams are quite small. All of our teams are one designer and one programmer, or sometimes one designer and two programmers. Then when the team kicks off the project, they discover their own tasks. So we're not trying to line up tasks in advance. We're acknowledging a reality of the universe, which is that you don't know what the work is until you get your hands dirty. You know, there's a little list of things that we come from our heads that says, okay, well, we're going to have to wire this up. We're going to have to connect that. There has to be this screen. There has to be that screen. But that list of 5 or 6 things that you know you need to do, that's not the actual work that ends up occupying your time hour after hour, day after day, week after week. You know, it's when you start doing that one thing and you open up the code and you realize, oh, that's connected to that. Like, shit, okay, all right, well, I guess we'll have to move this and refactor that. And then, you know, and then the designer starts and realizes, oh, but I don't have space for that. How am I going to move that here, right? And then all of these problems, and this is where the real work comes out. And this is also where all the edge cases we didn't anticipate, all the existing functionality that we didn't quite realize how nuanced it is, you know, all the things we have to handle. So we talk about imagined tasks versus discovered tasks. You know, all of the work that we think we're going to have to do isn't the real work. The work that we discover we have to do is the real work. And the way that we discover the real work is by actually doing real work. So by doing some design, by doing some coding, by actually trying to make something. So it's with our hands that we start to find out what the work is. So the team is then capturing all of that. And then lastly, we have a bunch of techniques that are in the book for how do we actually enable the teams to sort of deal with this, you know, discovering what's necessary, capturing the work, tracking the work. And maybe I won't get into that so much right now, but the main difference there is that rather than trying to estimate tasks and talk about how many tasks are left and what % complete are we, rather than talking about progress in those terms, we talk about progress in terms of knowns and unknowns. So what we really want is not necessarily, look, is that task going to take you 2 days or 4 days? I'm not so concerned about that. My fear is that if there's something in the work that the team actually can't find a solution for, or doesn't know how to do, or gets stuck on, you know, there's work that takes a little bit longer than you thought, right? Or there's more complexity to it, but you understand what you have to do. But then there's problems that come up where actually nobody can find the solution. Nobody knows what to do. And if that happens, there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to ship anymore. That sense of like, we are definitely going to somehow finish this thing by the end of the 6 weeks is out the window, because you might have a eureka in the bathtub, you know, 5 days from now about how to solve the problem, or you might never solve it. So unknowns are dangerous. So what we're really trying to do is we're taking anything that's in this category of deeply unknown, where we can't actually see through to the other side of what form that would take and how it would wire together and how it would work. If there's really something that's an unknown, that is something that should be worked out and explored before we make a bet, right? So before we make a bet, and we have some technical language for the different types of risk and probability that we deal with, and this is also in the book, but there's the type of risk where you don't know what you're getting into, and it could be, you know, a 6-month thing, or it could be a 3-day thing, or it could be, there could be a solution, there could be no solution. But if we get to a point where we actually do the pre-work to figure out if this thing is actually viable or not, then when we give it to a team, we can be very confident that there are no total holes in this thing that are going to completely blow up the project or sink it, right? But still, there's this process to the work where the team doesn't just look at a brief or look at a concept of some shaped work and say, okay, and now I will open up my terminal and start coding. Or the designer say, and now I will, you know, instantly deliver a UI for you. There is a sort of what we call uphill phase. The uphill phase is where we are figuring out, what does it actually take? What does it take to, what do I actually have to do here? What is the solution? How do I go about doing it? Like, I know this button has to be on the desktop and the mobile, but mobile has a different design than desktop. And where does it fit? Like, I know the task says, add the button to the UI, but where the heck is it going to go, right? And so there's this uphill phase of figuring out what your approach is and what the solution is. And then once you've figured it out, okay, on the mobile, it goes under the action menu here. On the desktop, we'll expose it under the left-hand sidebar over here. Now I know what to do. There's still actual execution work involved in changing the style sheets, doing the testing, right? Like adjusting the copy, getting feedback on whether the shadow is right on the button style, whatever it happens to be. And that's all the downhill work then. So there's the uphill of figuring out what to do and the downhill of actually executing it. And the risk regime of the uphill world, right? That uphill phase where I don't know what the solution is yet. I don't know how to do it. That's where all the danger is in the project. And so we're actually using this thing we have called the hill chart to track that uphill phase and then see where is the work in terms of unknown versus known. Okay, so I think I just dumped a lot on you in the course of 35 minutes. I can show you some things to make it a little bit more concrete. Just a couple of things that I talked about. I think you maybe have a sense of maybe how some of our thinking is a bit different and some of the things that we're doing differently. I'll show you just a short example of what shaped work looks like. I have a little slideshow here prepared. And let's see here. Zoom wants me to click a few things. And if I click those things, maybe it'll work. Let's see. Okay. Do you see a cartoon?
Yes, we do.
Actually, I don't. Okay, good. Thank you for saying that, because your picture became small and I can't see if the tiny heads are nodding or not. What's going on in the corner of my screen there? Okay, so I'll give you an example of what shaping work looks like. We had a customer who came to us and they said, please, could you build a calendar into version 3 of Basecamp? So we actually had a calendar in version 2 of Basecamp, and it was a massive project for us. It took us 6 months to build. It was a lot of engineering. It was a lot of design. And it turned out actually that only about 10% of our customers, 10% of the Basecamp 2 customers regularly used this calendar, which for us was a very expensive thing to build. So when it came time for us we built version 3 of Basecamp from scratch, we didn't include a calendar at all in it. Instead, we had a kind of very simple sort of schedule feature. And the schedule just allowed you to sort of make like an agenda view of here's the major deadlines or milestones or important dates, but there wasn't an actual interactive, calendar display. So we launched Basecamp 3. Customers are asking us, can you please build a calendar into Basecamp? And we thought, no, like we don't want to spend 6 months on it again. People didn't use it when we did build it. Well, this is a big, hairy project that we don't know how to do, right? But the questions kept coming. They didn't come overwhelmingly, but they were enough that we thought, you know what? We have a little bit of appetite for this. If there was some way that we could come up with to build a calendar in only 6 weeks, like we would do that. We would do that in order to make these people happy and to have a better answer to give them and support and so on. But we didn't know how to do that. Basically, what we were saying to ourselves is, if we could build a 10th of a calendar, we would do it. But we didn't know which 10th, right? So this is a case where we would not take this project and then give it to a team and say, you have 6 weeks to figure out which 10th of a project to do, which 10th of a calendar to build, right? Because we only have an appetite for 6 weeks. I mean, that would just be a death sentence to that team, because how are they supposed to, in that tight deadline, do all that discovery and research work to sort of see if there is actually a viable path to do this or not? So this happens outside of the cycle in the open field of shaping land, okay? And so what we ended up doing was we actually ended up interviewing some customers, and we got a good sense of what was going on actually behind these requests. Here's an example. So we had this situation that we sort of mapped out the story. So we talked to a customer, and she says, the client called when I was out of the office asking if I could see them. And it turned out that her company had sort of a big calendar painted on a chalkboard, and they had some meeting rooms for clients, and they would use the chalkboard calendar to mark off if they were going to use that meeting room that day to meet with a client, right? And but she was out of the office, and the client calls, and when that situation happens to her, and she's using a hand-drawn calendar on the wall in the office, then what happens is she has to drive to the office 30 minutes to go look at the calendar to see if she can even see the client or not, right? And she writes us and she says, look, I had to drive through traffic to get to the office. I finally get there and there isn't even a space on the calendar. What a pain, right? And so what this tells us is that if we look at what sort of she really was saying when she said, can you please give me a calendar? What she was saying was, I need to be able to see when rooms are available when I'm away from the office. Now, what is Google Calendar, for example? I mean, Google Calendar is invitation management, right? It's high fidelity dragging interactions to move things between slots on your day calendar, right? It's all kinds of sophisticated pulling in calendars from different sources and combining them, my personal calendar, your calendar, seeing everything like that, like making requests to each other. There's a ton of functionality there. But what we learned was that what was really important for this customer was actually seeing, I just need to see some empty spaces in order to schedule resources. And it's not my whole calendar for my business. It's not all my personal life. It's just like, when are these rooms available? It's just resource allocation, actually. And so what we were able to do was sort of define a negative space where the solution should go. So here we've done work to shape the problem. We don't know what the solution is, but we understand the problem enough that we've sort of we've created constraints, and we've sort of defined this smaller empty space for us to fill in with a solution. We're still not ready to give this to a team, but now we're starting to make progress. And so we combined this with our appetite, and we said, now that I think about it, if all they have to do is see empty spots, is there a simpler version of this? And we had a sort of a brainstorming session, and we thought, you know what? When you're on your phone with somebody, on let's say your iPhone, and they ask, are you free for dinner? You know, hey, let's get together. Like, nice to see you. Like, we should catch up. Let's get dinner next week. And you say, okay, let me see if I'm free. How do you do it? You open up your iPhone, and there's this kind of honestly quite bad interface that has a month view, but then there's dots on the days that tell you if there's something going on that day or not. It doesn't really help you immediately, just to see a dot on a day, but it's progress. You can see if there's any empty space at all on that day, right? But you manage. You say, well, let's see, Wednesday looks free, and you tap Wednesday, and then you see a list view underneath of what your things are on that Wednesday. And it seems to work for being able to do this. So we thought to ourselves, what if we could actually solve the problem in a similar way with what we call the dot grid calendar? And it's very, very constrained. All it does is we have two months. And this was sort of inspired by like airline booking interfaces, we've got two monthly calendar grids side by side. If anything is scheduled on that day, and remember, this is in Basecamp, so this could just be inside the context of a project. This is not like everything on your calendar. This is within a certain context in this app. If something is booked that day, we'll just show a dot on that day. And if you click that day, it will scroll underneath sort of the expanded list view of what's scheduled that day. And this will basically make it manageable to click around and find a free space. And this is the point where we said, now we have a concept that we believe in. We have a narrowed definition of the problem we understand. We have an appetite that tells the team sort of what the solution has to fit into. And we have the key components of a viable solution. Now, there were a million things that the team had to solve. Here we can see sort of the shaped work versus the finished work. There were actually a lot of little things the team had to figure out to deal with how to display different types of events with different types of multi-day events versus spanned times and stuff like that. But we had done enough of our homework before we made the bet to get confident that this was actually viable. So this is an example of the type of upfront work that we do. I think, there's a lot in the book and there's a lot I could talk about. I think I've given you maybe enough to motivate some questions. So let's take it and spin it that way and see if there's anything you all would like to talk about. And I think there's a roaming microphone or something so I can hear you.
I actually have two questions. The first one is, this all sounds fantastic and it's great. How do you help product management team that doesn't work for David and Jason, right? Because those guys are more than willing to tell a customer, guess what? You get to wait 6 weeks. But most people don't work for people who are willing to do that. The second thing is, when does the shaping happen? Because you've talked about the team being busy for 6 weeks on the bet and then having a 2-week sort of cooling down period, so who's doing the shaping and when does it happen?
Excellent. Okay, both good questions. My video just came up on me and I see I'm in the dark now. It's getting dark here, so I hope you can still see me all right. Okay, the first thing, this question about Jason and David have nothing to do with this. This is structural depending on the type of work you do and the way that you sell. Okay, if you sell to customers because you have a better mousetrap, you can absolutely tell them we're busy for the next 6 weeks. Absolutely. Because either the thing that you offer is superior or it's not, as it is, right? Now, if you're doing totally custom development where you're not actually doing product work, this book is totally written within the context of doing product work, right? So we actually have some very interesting stories from our past experience applying this to client projects. And that's something that we could talk about. But I just wanted to put that out there. So this is about product work. And if you have a product that you sell on the basis of that product being better than the competition, it should be better before people start asking you to change it, right? And so that comes down to having competent salespeople and so on. But then we could talk a lot about how this applies to clients. The second part, sort of when does shaping happen and how does shaping happen? This is also structural. This is a function of the scale of the business, like where you're at in terms of the size of the company. So in the beginning, when there's just 3 of you and everybody has to do everything, then it doesn't make sense to sort of have this discrete time of 6 weeks of building and then 2 weeks of cool down, because everybody's doing everything. And anyway, you're going to be interrupted with talking to customers. You're going to get interrupted with technical things that come up. I mean, so it doesn't fit to separate that out into that clear structure. However, it is a basic fact of the universe that projects don't come from nowhere, that they start with raw ideas, like maybe we should do this, maybe we should build that. And the phase of work with maybe we should do this, maybe we should do that, has a completely different risk profile than work that's gone through the shaping process. So regardless of whether we are in fixed cycles or not, we don't want to commit even our own selves, like our own future time, to saying, Now we will go and we will build that feature. If we haven't done sort of this preliminary work to actually validate that we have a concept for that feature and there aren't any holes in it, and it is technically viable, and it does fit the appetite of what we want to spend on it, right? So there's a sense of being deliberate and being conscious about what it is that we're taking on and how much time we want to spend on it and what we're going to get when we're done and what done looks like. That's something that we can do whether we're in a sort of 6-week structure or we're in a little bit of a chaotic environment where we're, you know, working more ad hoc and we say, well, we could bite this off for 2 weeks and we think that that's where we want to go with that, right? In the case then when you get bigger, you start to hire some more people. Like, so where Basecamp is today, we're about 50 people in the entire company, including support and operations and everything like that. And we're about 12 people in the product team. At that size, we're big enough now where we can have sort of 2 tracks. We can have one track where where there's a teams that only build, and there's other groups that only shape. And then during the 6 weeks, the shapers are shaping what to do in a potential future cycle. And during the 6 weeks, the builders are building what was shaped in bet previously.
I think I got a question. Really appreciate any process that breaks us free from being Jira slinging ticket monkeys. But my question's about appetite. I'm curious about how it's measured and who contributes to that. I know you had mentioned that there's certain people who make decisions, or there's certain, you know, groups there, but I'm just curious, you know, as appetite is measured, a little bit about how it's measured and who is involved with that.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we're also trying to democratize the work a bit here.
Well, I think we're not. And I think that's the biggest mistake of this whole swing toward agile, is democratizing the work, actually. We need the people who actually control resources. So the people who decide who gets to spend time on what, they're the ones who schedule people's time. It's their job and their responsibility to be deliberate about what they want that time to be spent on. Because what's happening today is we all say it's democratic, but what that really means is we just say yes to everything because nobody has the power to say no, right? So it all goes on the backlog, right? And then depending on which fire is burning hotter, then we whip everybody and say, well, these are the 4 things that have to absolutely get done in the next 2 weeks. But then don't worry, 2 weeks after that, we'll do everything else, right? So what we actually need is to make trade-offs. And the only about what we spend time on, that we only have so much time. And so we have to make a priority about what is worth the time. And the only people who can actually make the trade-off are the people who have the dollar bills in their wallet, right? The people who own the resources are the only ones who can actually decide how the resources get spent. So this is why it's so important to become more deliberate and conscious of sort of who makes the bets and how do those bets get made. And so we can get into then sort of how do we define an appetite, how do we frame it? But I think the short version of that is the people who have the money in their pocket or who decide on what programmers get to spend their time on, for example, they ultimately get to set the appetite. And so what we're doing at the betting table is we're trying to have a strategic conversation together about what is important. And then if we can have if I can, let's say, persuade, let's say David doesn't want to spend time on something. If I can make a really strong strategic case that this is actually really valuable and important, then his notion of what his appetite is might increase through that discussion, right? But it's very productive for us to know sort of who actually has the appetite, because they're the ones that actually get to decide how we spend our time.
Hey, Ryan, it's starting to look like a scene in a movie. You're fading away on us.
Let's see if I can find a light somewhere. Let's see.
I'm going to hand the microphone over to Stephen, who's got a question for you as well. So,
how's that?
Yeah, better. By the way, you can only see about half the room in the camera view right now. So I'm standing in the middle, and you're missing about 20 folks this way. So
okay.
Pass the mic around.
Okay.
Hey Ryan, how you doing? Love all this. My question is, you've got a shaped project. Are you shaping a project based on the execution team, that what you think they can handle? Or is there some sort of like, do you have to understand like the level of developer who's executing you versus like a superstar? So is there a variance between the two?
Wow, that's a really great question. I would say that that's a really good question. Short answer is yes. It does make a difference who you expect to give the project to. Um, there's basically sort of two levels to the risk management of this, right? The first, the basic level of risk management is this viable for any of us, right? So when we're doing the shaping, we want to make sure that there are no rabbit holes that are like literally holes in the concept, right? That no matter how good you are, there just isn't a solution, or it's not feasible in the amount of time that we thought, right? That's the first level. Then if the team is a little more junior or something like that, we might go a second level where we not only look for the real holes in the concept, we also look for the things that somebody might get lost in because they don't quite have the maturity to make the decision of like, oh, this isn't so important and I shouldn't spend 3 weeks spinning my wheels on this, you know? So what we might do is we might be a little bit more, not quite sure what the word is, like declarative about some of the particulars, you know, where we're saying, when it comes to this particular point, there's an example in the book, in the chapter called Risks and Rabbit Holes, about this case study on to-do groups. And basically there was an issue with how do we address completed items in this to-do list. We knew kind of the answer, but we were concerned that the team would actually explore 4 or 5 different solutions instead of just sort of seeing that that was the answer, right? And there were other things that we were very happy to give the team the latitude to explore and make their own conclusion on. But this one thing was like, you know what? We had a hard enough conversation between ourselves about this during the shaping that we think this could really become a real sidetrack for people. So we're going to call this out in the pitch, in the document where we present the shaped work, and say, by the way, when it comes to the completed to-dos, don't even bother exploring it. Like, this is the way to go.
Hi, sorry. Hi, Ryan. Thank you very much
Hey there.
for a customer at Basecamp and run a distributed company, so we're huge fans.
Oh, cool.
Just a couple questions. I won't try to bombard you with them, but you said 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and if you have that circuit breaker, you commit to it and you kind of close it off. So then you start on something else, and how do you deal with the changing cost of we come back to that, 3-6 weeks later, or you're whoever's on the team saying, oh, it's actually only 2 more weeks. We don't need a full 6 weeks to do it. So how do you then schedule that in
Yeah.
the cycles? And then the other thing just being, where do you put in training or other things that come along with being on your team? So things like education, training, stuff like this. And then finally, the third thing, and again, sorry for multiple questions.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Is so let's say you scope hammer and you actually get something out, but it's not in the end, what you wanted. How do you know how do you track at the end? Okay, our appetite was correct. Our appetite wasn't correct. What actually came out of it was good or not? Like, I guess the kind of retrospective of it.
Okay. Yeah, those are a lot of really good questions. I'll see if I can remember. Just tell me if I forget along the way. So the first is, so the first thing is that when it comes to if we actually, when the circuit breaker fires and a project that should have gotten done in 6 weeks doesn't get done, that could happen in one of 2 cases. One case is that there was some uphill work that never got solved. If that's the case, we are definitely not going to reinvest because there's a hole, and we have to go back and into the sort of shaping side of things to figure out what we actually think the answer to that hole is before we would consider betting more time on it, right? It may be, we've had cases where a project hit the circuit breaker, the project blew up, we realized that our fundamental approach was wrong. And then it was many cycles later that we finally had a very different angle on the whole thing. And then we pursued it with a different approach, and then we were successful. We've had other cases where we're at the end of the 6 weeks, the circuit breaker pops, and we look at what's going on, and we see that there's just a little bit of downhill work. There's no uncertainty about it. It's just mostly labor. And it's kind of like, well, if we gave it another 1 or 2 weeks, we could wrap it up. Something I didn't mention earlier is that we actually, at our current size, we can have 2 different teams working in parallel for each 6-week cycle. One of them we call Big Batch, and they dedicate the entire 6 weeks to one project. The other we call Small Batch, and we give them a little grab bag of 2-week, 1-week projects. We don't schedule them like by week 1 will you do this, and by week 2 you will do that. It's more like, here's these 3 things. They're all kind of bite size. Somehow by the end of the cycle, you should have these 3 things done. So that gives us the flexibility to piece in something like that that's a little bit smaller in a future cycle if we decide it's worth that bet. So then the second thing, how do we make time for training and education? We don't need that, I don't think. I think that what's happening is because nobody is ever in the ticket taker mode, they're never alone, you know? So what happens is when somebody comes in, we have sensitivity to if somebody is a bit more junior, and then that factors in to how we put the team together when we make the bet, you know? So we might put someone a little more junior with somebody more senior, and then we might also arrange for them to have someone to reach out to for a little bit of review occasionally during the work. But the best way for them to train is by doing real work, you know? So we want to just throw them in the water with a shaped project that's shaped in tune with their abilities, you know, but has enough extra space in the shoes for their feet to grow into, you know? And that's how we handle that. We don't have explicit training education periods. And then the final one, tell me again what it was. It was a good one.
Sorry, I think I forgot it myself, so it's okay.
That's too bad. I thought it was really good at the time. Yeah, okay. If it comes back, you know.
It was retrospectives. So how do you?
Yes, retrospectives. Thank you. Yes. So this is very good. So here's the thing. What we've done by talking about shaping, building, and betting is whether or not you actually use this structure. This is a fact of the universe. An omelet comes from raw eggs. Doesn't matter how you cook your omelet, right? And work comes from somewhere. Whether you have a distinct shaping process or not, you have to figure out what it is before you can do it, right? And resources get scheduled, whether or not you have a sort of betting table or not. These decisions are getting made somehow, right? And by using this language and having these concepts, it allows us to tease apart the different types of work that go into a project so that when something goes wrong, we can ask different questions about where the problem lies. So for example, did we make a mistake in the shaping because there was a big glaring hole in the concept that we should have been able to foresee, right? But let's say we were too rushed and we didn't really give it a good look when we were supposed to be de-risking it. And we just said, oh, it'll be fine. And we threw it over to the team, right? Then we could say, it doesn't matter which team did this. You should have been more diligent in your shaping. Then we can say, okay. Or we could say, you know what, when we look back at the shaping, that was actually quite sound. And all the guardrails were there. And it was a good, solid concept. And there was a performance problem, you know, in the design or developer there. We can make that distinction. Or we could have a successfully shaped project that gets built and shipped, and customers hate it, and it's a big problem for us, right? Who made that bet, right? So now we're having a conversation, a strategic conversation about who was making the strategic decision that was a way to spend our time. So now that we can untangle these, I think we can make that debrief much more constructive.
Hi. So I got 2 questions. One is, when you go 6 weeks, how do you determine if the project is done? Did the team just say, yep, here it is? They give you like a basic demonstration of the project, and then you guys say it's good to go? or you decided, or they come to you and say, we're not even close, or we're kind of close. The second question is, at the betting table, I'm assuming that you're not hearing about all the projects at once. So are you getting some sort of an overview days in advance? Are you getting the same projects being groomed further and further? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take this. Let's see. First one was, there's so much in both of these topics that I already got my brain full just from listening to the second question. What was the first one again?
The first one was, how do you know after the sixth?
How do you know when it's done? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. How do you know when it's done? I'll take the second one first. The betting table is not, there's no grooming happening. There's literally only 3 or 4 options on the table. So we're going to think about it. This is C-suite time, right? Those people don't have time. So if you get 2 hours where you're going to be able to get on the phone together, you better bring a couple really good options. That's how that works. So I might personally have a big portfolio privately of things that I might want to shape in the next cycle, things that I think are strategically interesting, things that I think they might want to bet on. You know what I mean? But for my responsibility is to narrow all that down. And when I get to the betting table, I want to have like 2 things to show them and be like, here's the 2 things that I want to lobby for this cycle. So it's an intensely productive conversation about a few options that have a lot of pre-work that's gone into them. With all the questions basically answered already. So it's a very intense, short, productive conversation, and everything happens there. Then to the first question, how do you know if it's done? The first thing is that because we are doing better shaping up front, the definition of done is apparent before anybody starts. Everybody has a very, very clear concept of what this thing is, what it's supposed to be. So when you kind of think about that calendar example I showed, that awful messy sketch, we could talk that through with people for 20 minutes, and everybody's going to say, I completely understand what this thing is and what you're intending and where we should be by the end of 6 weeks on this, right? So then the review along the way, our basic attitude is we don't want to have to do any review at all. We want the team to just do it, and we want to be pleasantly surprised at the end of 6 weeks. That's our sort of default response. Now, of course, you end up kind of workshopping things along the way, you know? And sometimes you have people who you might be a little bit nervous about whether or not they're going to be able to get through a certain problem in the design or something like that. So there is a kind of ad hoc random review that happens at different points throughout the 6 weeks. But basically what we're looking at is we want to see, and there's a whole chapter about this in the book called Get One Piece Done. We want to see a core, meaningful part of this problem solved in running code that we can click on that does something at the end of the first week. So show me that you can, whatever is like a core piece of this, put just enough UI. It doesn't need to be all perfectly styled. It can be actually a bit rough. Just enough UI that there's something to click on, and just enough backend that when I click on it, something happens, right? And it should be something that is actually intrinsic, to this domain or to this problem. So don't build me login first when you've built login 1,000 times to authenticate with a username and password. Build me the thing that shows the dot on the calendar day, right? And I click on that and it reveals a list below, right? And there might be a million edge cases that aren't yet solved, but if I can see that a core piece of that concept that was shaped is already working in real code, then we've left the realm of the sort of scary, risky, hypothetical, speculative realm to the world of like real stuff that we see in front of our noses that we can trust that works. And then it's the second order. It's the momentum of the team being able to do that again and again and show, look, here's another piece where both the front end and the back end are working together that gives us all confidence that it's working. This is the opposite of what you very often see, where there's like a lot of work going into high fidelity mockups, and then those high fidelity mockups go over the wall to a front end engineer, and the front end engineer gives it to the back end people. And like, you're never done with anything until like everything has been done to this like full degree of fidelity. We're doing the total opposite of that. We're doing a little slice of UI and a little slice of back end. And then we're seeing how this one piece of the concept works end to end, and then getting validation by integrating early like that. And then we can sort of rinse and repeat. And if we're seeing a good momentum with that, it means that we're going to land in a good place at the end of the 6 weeks. And if we're not seeing good momentum with that, then it means that there's some trouble. And I didn't get into the hill charts in this talk just because of time. But if you look in the book on the hill chart chapter, that shows you the actual reporting mechanism that we use to sort of look over the shoulder of the team and see if they're making the right kind of progress or not through the 6 weeks.
Hey, Ryan, Dan Moore. Thanks again for sharing your time with us. One kind of question. So it does sound like there's a wall between the shaping team and the delivery team. So I think
yes,
that and talks a lot about dual track development and how a discovery team and a delivery team should include a lot of the same members. How do you, well, I guess one question is, on the agile side, there's often a product owner that's part of the team itself. So who do the delivery team go to for questions? Like, do they get with you and the betting team at all? And then vice versa, do they get to be involved in any of the shaping work, or how do they elevate their skills or see what's happening in that betting team?
Right. Okay. So just the first answer is quite easy. Whoever did the shaping or is available as a support to the team to workshop things ad hoc or review things ad hoc if the team would find it valuable. And it could be that in our case, because there's overlap between the shapers and the management of the company, you know, like Jason will do shaping, but he's also the boss. He's also the CEO. He might be curious how a project is coming in and sort of basically asking for a demo, you know, and then they sort of have an opportunity to get feedback from the person the concept came from right there and then, right? But it's very ad hoc, and it's not something that we actually design ourselves so that by default we don't want that to happen. But then when it's needed from time to time, then it's constructive and it's useful to have that back and forth. To the deeper question of sort of the separation between these roles and what happens if somebody who's building would like to be shaping and so on. The first thing that's really important to look at here is that this isn't a difference in power. It's a difference in the type of work. It's literally different work. And doing different work requires time. So if somebody is a designer or a programmer, building out UI and programming, it's hard, complicated work that requires detailed in the weeds expertise and lots and lots of hours to actually make anything, right? Making anything actually work is hard and takes lots of time. So the team is busy. They're busy doing things that they're better at than I am as a shaper. And if they wanted to shape, they would need to stop programming. And then they would have to go talk to customers and pursue a bunch of dead ends and do some sort of modeling to come up with some sort of a strategic idea of why this is worth pursuing instead of that, right? There's a whole bunch of work that I have to do as a shaper that takes up all of my time. And because of that, if I wanted to go if I wanted to go back into programming more, I would have to stop shaping and start programming, right? So these are just different roles doing different types of work. And the more that we see, wow, you're not just, you know, sitting there on a high chair somewhere dictating what we do, you're actually doing work to do this shaping, right? It takes time and energy and knowledge and expertise. Then we actually build up a great deal of mutual respect for each other, right? And then if someone feels like shaping is where they would like to be in their career, like I feel like I'm building all the time and somehow it's not satisfying to me, I would like to be working at a slightly more abstract level or a more strategic role, then we have more clarity now about what that work is. It's not a power position like, well, if you become manager 3 stripes instead of 2 stripes on your shoulder, then you get to shape. No. If you demonstrate interest and ability in doing this other type of work, then this might be a place for you to move to in the company as like what you do, right? And of course, there's only limited slots available for someone to do that, but they could also go do it at some other company, right? And then that's a constructive thing. And we have other people who they are really, really good and interested in the puzzle of how to make the CSS work, how to get the code to run, the logical consistency of it all. And they find the floating in space quality of doing strategy to be actually a little bit unpleasant. They would actually prefer more certainty of being down there fixing the engine and stuff like that. So I think if we look at it in terms of different types of work and available time, it becomes a very practical conversation about what do you want to be doing and what's possible and what skills do you have and how can we nurture that instead of a power struggle.
Just a quick question. So this is all very happy days, happy flow. Everything's wonderful. 6 weeks, 2 weeks off. For anybody who wanted to start out implementing this framework, is there any advice? Is there any signals that lessons you've learned that you would go like, oh my God, don't do this, or signals that might be like a red flag that would say, warning, warning, this is a problem. Any advice you can give basically at all? Because I'm looking to do this personally. So.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually have not seen anything that came back to me as like somebody got burned or somebody really had some pain as a result of trying to adopt too much too fast. Mostly what I'm seeing is that there tend to be some sort of obstacles to certain aspects of the method depending on the structure that you're embedded within organizationally. If you are a founder of a tiny startup and you're the one that wants to do this, you can just do it, right? And if you are on the other hand, if you're a product manager and there's a CTO above you and the CTO is the one that is sort of gets to choose what programmers spend their time on, then you're in a very different situation because you might want to have more deliberate bets. But there's something going on above you organizationally where the CTO wants to, do the big refactoring and sales wants you to build 8 new features and the CEO has some cockamamie idea from the shower yesterday. And they're all like, none of them are talking together at a betting table to decide what we should all do in the next cycle, And if you're in that kind of a situation, then the betting part is going to be a challenge because you don't have influence over that. But what you will be able to find is that very often you can make progress from shaping very early, because what's happening is unshaped work is going down the pipe in some form, no matter how bets are getting made or how time is getting scheduled. And then it blows up in people's faces because there were a whole bunch of unknowns that nobody addressed beforehand. So rather than kind of having this sort of slapdash meeting where everybody just says, okay, yep, that's the next work for the next cycle. Okay, that's what we'll do. Allocating more time up front with 1 or 2 people in a closed door session to go deep on that work before making the commitment to it, this will have a really, really big impact. So that's one thing that I can really recommend as a starting point. And if you are in a situation where you have influence over the way work gets scheduled and resources get allocated and so on, I'm hearing a lot of really good stories from people who say, we couldn't sell management. People above us didn't want us to go to 6 weeks. They were a little bit afraid of that, but they let us go to 4 weeks with a 1-week cool down. And man, we're doing a lot better. And we think that we'll get them over to 6 weeks eventually. I'm seeing some of that. And we're also seeing people just do it whole hog. But like I said, there's different obstacles you can run into, but I haven't seen anybody get burned yet.
Great stuff, Ryan. Very excited about it. Does anyone else have any other questions? Ryan? Ryan, we really appreciate you speaking with us tonight. Any parting words, wisdom? I know one thing that we touched on ad hoc is like, how does it feel not to have a product backlog? It must be pretty invigorating, right? Pretty freeing. I think To me, that takes a burden off of the teams to look ahead and to be able to do some of the work. I mean, how do you guys view that?
Yeah, the big difference there is the trust. The main thing a backlog does is it erodes trust, because when people can't agree about what to do, they say put it on the backlog, right? A friend of mine has the joke. He says that his Netflix watch later list is his watch never list, because if he wanted to watch it, he would have just hit play. And so it becomes this, like, all this stuff that you're sort of like, oh, maybe one day, but actually it was a way to say no. It was a political way to say no, and put it on the backlog, right? And everybody learns that put it on the backlog means maybe we'll do it, maybe we won't, I don't know. It's a very confusing message. If instead we say, every time a new idea comes up, we say, interesting. Yeah, maybe one day, interesting. But it doesn't go onto any kind of a commitment. It doesn't go into any kind of a queue. And then when the only messaging you get from leadership is like, here are the things that we're betting on for next cycle, and they actually happen, then you develop a very powerful trust relationship. And you understand that in order for something to get bet on, there's a negotiation that has to happen. There's some deep work that has to happen, and some deep conversations to say what's important, what's meaningful. Is this the right time? Is this not the right time? And if it's not the right time, whoever thinks that thing is important, they take that home. And then they watch for when's the right moment again to lobby again, right? And then they come back and they say, hey, this thing, I didn't forget about that. And I still think we should do it. And here's why. And here's why I think this is the right time to do it, right? And so there's a lot of clarity and there's a lot of trust, and everybody actually knows what you're doing and what you're not doing, instead of this wall of things that you feel you're supposed to do, but everybody knows isn't really going to happen. But it's very unclear, and it's a big weight, actually, this backlog, and it's not necessary.
Great stuff, by the way. That does resemble my Netflix watch list. The thing I'll ask is that for folks that are in the audience that are interested in learning more or reading the book, where would you point them at this point? Because I know I've checked my Audible account and it's not quite there yet.
I tell you, I'm almost done recording the audio version, so it's coming. I've got two or three chapters left to edit, and then we have some post-production stuff to do, but it's coming. So you'll find the book at basecamp.com/shapeup, and you can read the whole thing online right there. And we also have a PDF version available for download. We're going to be doing other formats, but we wanted to give ourselves room to sort of edit the text in accordance with the feedback we got early before we went to a format that was less plastic. So you can read that online. And there's also some tips in the back about how to get started, how it works at different size of companies, the difference between working on a brand new product versus working on an existing product. There's some stuff there that you can find that might also help you to contextualize some of this. So, but anyway, I hope that it was at least a sort of an introduction to the ideas, and it gives you something to chew on going home.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And Brian, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
All right, folks, we'll wrap up. And again, Ryan, thanks for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.